can take off.
Okay, I have like 3 minutes to 5, but happy to start. Yeah?
Is it? So I don't know.
No, I think it's fine.
Okay, my computer's slow. All right, so welcome everyone to VMACS. Hope everyone's doing well. So just to reiterate the ground rules for the seminar, everyone's audio and video is going to be muted. You cannot change this, and we will not unmute you without your prior consent. You can ask questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and try not to use the chat unless you have technical issues. We have co-authors here who are going to be able to answer your clarifying questions during the talk, which will be 60 minutes via the Q&A function. And then after the talk, we'll have 30 minutes for more substantive questions and conversation. And for that, you could just use the raise your hand option at the bottom. Before we actually start today, we have some organizational issues. I'm just going to turn it over to Morten for a moment for some announcements, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, so we had a call out for volunteers to organizing VMACS Junior during July, and we had a lot of applications for that, actually above 80. So so we decided to not only launch VMACS Junior, but also VMACS conference later on, and it was terribly difficult to choose out of the 80 applicants, but let me tell you who we have chosen to be the organizers of those two things. So first of all, VMACS July, which will be sort of a junior forum rather than these more senior talks. And on that, the organizing committee will be Lufu Koulibaly, Corina Bohr, Tommaso Borzio, Kieran Larkin, Josepa Martinez, and Kachaman. And then for the VMACS conference, which we imagine will be later on in the summer, and the idea here is that this year, for example, there's no SCD conference, so there's no specialized major macro conference. So the idea would be to have something that at least partially substitutes for that. And on that committee, we have Jiyeon Kim, Kyle Dempsey, Rocio Madeira, Christian Wolf, Abdoulaye Ndaye, Omar Rakedi, Elisa Giannone, and Simon Wangi. So we will be back about the details of this and get the committees to work, and we hope it will be exciting. So let's see what's going to happen there.
Okay, thanks, and thanks everyone who applied. It was really great to get so many applications. So without further ado, we have today, Stefania Albanesi will be presenting her joint work with Rania Gihleb, Jialin Huo, and Jiyeon Kim. Stefania, go right ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. So this is joint work with my colleague Rania and Jialin. And
Stefania, at least I'm seeing your slides very tiny.
Okay, let me see what happened here. I'm not sure. Let me stop the share and start again. One second.
It was big before, and then it just went small.
Yes, sorry. Something went wrong. Okay, let's go full screen again. Okay, you should see full size. Okay, great, thanks so much. Okay, this is joint work with Rania, Jialin, and Jiyeon, and it's we're basically presenting work in progress on the role of household insurance in the economic impact of the novel coronavirus. And the premise of our work is that in a typical recession, actually employment drops more in male-dominated occupations and industries, particularly production industries and production occupations. And so this is something that has become more well-known, but is was not as well-known recently. So the fact that production and goods occupation are more cyclical implies that in a typical recession, men lose more jobs than women. And as Matthias also discussed in his VMACS talk a few weeks ago, most standard recessions are in fact men's recession, a word that became, popular around the time of the Great Recession when the media caught on to this stylized fact. And but the industry's distribution is not the only factor. So in work that I've done before, I've actually showed that married women tend to increase labor force participation during recession. And this is basically an intra-household insurance mechanism. So they increase participation to offset potential expected loss in earnings or employment on part of the primary earner of the household, which is typically the husband. And recently there has been quite a bit of work on this intra-household insurance channel in particularly structurally estimated household choice models and in some macro models. Now, as we will show you, the COVID recession is quite different. Because of social distancing, mitigation activity, and so on, there has been a large decline in service-type occupations and jobs that are primarily female-dominated. And so on the one hand, there's going to be a disparate impact on female workers. But on the other hand, this intra-household insurance mechanism that we usually see in a typical recession may be inactive for a lot of households. And so we can think about intra-household insurance as an automatic stabilizer in a standard recession. And this may not be present for many types of households in the United States, but also potentially in other countries. And so what we want to sort of start exploring here is what the implications are of this, both at the household level and ultimately in the aggregate in terms of the size and magnitude of the recession. So the outline of the talk is that we're going to present some evidence, just review the cyclicality of hours by gender, industry, and occupation, and then we're going to go through our take on this, which is to classify occupation essentially by their sensitivity to the COVID-19 shock. So we're going to look at the degree of contact with coworkers and the public, and the degree to which occupations can be performed remotely. And then we're going to document the distribution across these occupations classified in this manner by gender and at the household level. And then we can start looking at some real-time data on employment by gender and occupation using the March and April employment situation data that has come out. And then we're going to present a stylized macro models that has quite a bit of heterogeneity by gender, occupation, and industry, and an integrated SIR dynamic population for the spread of the coronavirus. And we're going to use this model as a laboratory to start examining the redistributional effects at the household level, which is mainly what I'll be talking about today. And then ultimately we'll use the model to think about the aggregate impact of this particular household channel. Now, very briefly on the literature. So there is by now a very large literature on integrating, pandemic models into macro. Many of those papers have been presented here. There is a small literature on gender and business cycles, and Matthias, reviewed it very thoroughly in his VMACS talks a few weeks ago. And increasingly, there is a literature on intra-household insurance. So the channel that we were emphasizing was originally referred to as the added worker effect, and is due to Shelley Lumberg, who looked at it first in her PhD dissertation. In the past, I would say 5 to 7 years, there has been quite a bit of work, both in applied micro and in more macro models, sort of exploring this channel. And then our work is also related on household inequality and sorting. So the impact of inequality within the household and across household on decisions at the household level. And of course, it's related to Matthias, Michelle, and work that was presented here a few weeks ago as well. Okay, so let's jump into our classification of occupations. And just as a premise, we are looking at occupations because we are interested in sort of understanding the defining feature of jobs that might be, impacted by social distancing and mitigation measures that are, either put in place by governments or just taken endogenously by workers and households households and businesses in response to the coronavirus. So the occupation seems the most natural, cut of the data to think about this. And so we use a dichotomy that is based on ONET, but we also validate the analysis with the ATOS data. And this is very similar to Mongi, Pilosov, and Weinberg, where they also look at occupations along this contact and remote work direction. They're not focusing on gender, but our classifications are actually very, very consistent. So the first dimension that we look at is high versus low contact occupations. And this is based on the original, insights of this paper by the St. Louis Fed economists Lebovici and others. Where basically, using the ONET, we actually have information on the distance that workers typically keep with coworkers and customers, and so we assign basically a grade or an index to the different two-digit occupations, and we then dichotomize them in two categories, high and low contact, and I'll show you which they are in the next slide. The second dimension that we consider is the flexible versus inflexible, where this flexibility simply measures the ability to perform work remotely. And there are 14 questions in ONET that we use to basically establish this ability, essentially give occupations at the two-digit level a grade along this dimension. And of course, occupations that require direct contact with heavy equipment, which is in the workplace, are going to be inflexible. Occupations that require, policing or patrolling grounds are inflexible. Construction is inflexible, and instead occupations that can be conducted remotely or with equipment that can be taken anywhere are flexible. And this dichotomy is also very similar to what was found in Dingle and Neiman, but also in the Jialin and others paper. And again, we give a grade to each occupation, and then we look at occupations that are above the median in terms of flexibility. Those are going to be the flexible occupation, and below the median are going to be the inflexible occupation. And so this is what they are. And you can see that this is a matrix. On the rows, we have high contact and low contact occupations, and on the columns, flexible and inflexible. So the low contact flexible occupations here are basically all the professional occupations. So management, architecture, social sciences, and so on, as well as administrative and sales occupations. The flexible high contact occupations are mainly education and library occupations. The high contact and inflexible occupations tend to be healthcare related, or personal care related, or food preparation related. And inflexible low contact occupations are the main one is actually construction. Production occupations are in that category, transportation, protective occupations, and so on. So this is the categorization that we use in the rest of the analysis, both in the empirical analysis and then in the model. There's going to be 4 occupations exactly with these characteristics. So let me give you some information on the distribution of these occupations. So if we first just look at high contact versus low contact, so high contact occupations, which are presumably more sensitive to the COVID shock, comprise about 23% of all employed workers, and the female share in those occupations is very high, 74%. Inflexible occupations comprise about 43% of employed workers, and the female share is relatively low, it's only 40%. But what's most interesting to us actually is to look at the interaction between flexibility and the degree of contact. And this is where we actually see the biggest gender differences. So in the flexible high contact group, the education occupation, you can see that this category accounts for 10% of all employed women, but only 3% of all employed men. And in general, it's a relatively small category, only 7%. The biggest standalone category is actually the flexible low contact, so all the professional and sales occupation, where the they account for 52% of employment, and it's quite a gender balanced category. And these are the occupations that we expect to be least sensitive to the COVID-19 shock. Then we have the inflexible high contact occupations, which are the ones that we expect to be most sensitive to the COVID-19 shocks. And you can see that here there's a very big gender imbalance with the female share being 74%, though this overall is not a very large occupation. It only accounts for 16% of all employment. And then at the bottom, we have the inflexible low contact occupations. So these are male-dominated and account for a relatively large fraction of all employment. So this is the categorization that we come up with and that we use. We've done some robustness analysis, and so the bottom line here that you need to take away is that in general, the most sensitive occupations to COVID, which are the inflexible high contact, are primarily female dominated. The least sensitive, which would be flexible low contact, are actually quite gender balanced, and they tend to involve professional occupations. So what we're really interested in, though, for our mechanism and our question is, how households distribute across these occupational categories. So not just looking at workers individually, but thinking for married households. And for now, we're looking at formally married households, and we'll expand our analysis to cohabitating couples as well, because it's sort of the same mechanism. But for married households, we wanted to see, the degree to which, different households were sensitive as a couple to the COVID shock. So in the extreme, a household in which both partners or both spouses are in inflexible high contact occupation is going to be particularly sensitive to the COVID-19 shock. Instead, a household in which both spouses are in a flexible low contact occupation, should be less sensitive to this kind of shock. So what you can see here is the distribution of households across these 16 possible types, which are obtained by interacting, the four occupations in all the possible combinations. Essentially, what you can see here, just to focus your attention, if we look at inside the matrix, you can see that 32% of all households are households in which both partners are inflexible low contact occupations. So those actually are a very large group of households which we expect to be less sensitive to the COVID-19 shock. And the other biggest categories are households in which the husband is in inflexible low contact occupations, which are 19% of those have the wife in a flexible low contact occupation, and 10% have the wife in an inflexible high contact occupation. So this is the biggest group. So this group, because the husband is in a low contact occupation, so the primary earner is possibly less sensitive to the COVID-19 shock, but this would be a household that is actually particularly sensitive to standard business cycle shocks, because the inflexible low contact occupations tend to be production occupations that tend to be quite cyclical. So in the model, we basically will have heterogeneity across households exactly along this dimension. So we're going to have 16 different types of households that are going to basically replicate the distribution of households with respect to the occupation of the two spouses in the data that we see in this table. Now, what I want to show you next, before we get to the sensitivity, it's important to point out that these different household types vary quite substantially in their level of earnings. So this is data from the 2019 March CPS, and just looks at total household labor earnings for the different household types. And you can see in the second term in the diagonal here that the flexible low contact households, where both partners are in this category, are the household with the highest earnings. And this is because college educated spouses are overrepresented in this group. So not only are they potentially less exposed to the COVID-19 shock, but also they are, they have higher average income, so they're going to have higher levels of savings and wealth, to possibly buffer or offset any decline in income that they face. And you can also see that the lowest earnings accrue to households in which both spouses are in inflexible low contact occupations. So households in which both spouses tend to work in production occupations. So the pre-pandemic shock earnings are going to be something that matters in the context of the model in terms of determining the welfare implications of the COVID shock and the distributional impact of the COVID shock. Now, what I want to spend some time on now is describing the evidence on the degree of exposure to standard business cycle risk and then to the COVID-19 shock to the extent that we can measure it with the data that has come out so far. So this should be familiar if you attended, the talk a few weeks ago by Matthias Döpke, or if you've read, some of my papers or the handbook chapter on family macro. So this is using annual data from the March supplement of the CPS, plots the standard deviation relative to GDP of log hours per capita, the cyclical component extracted with a simple HP filter, and the correlation, contemporaneous correlation with GDP of hours for men, women, and in the aggregate. And you can see that particularly the standard deviation of the cyclical component of hours is much lower for women than for men, but also the correlation. So this is the basic observation that for standard business cycles, female hours tend to be a lot less sensitive to business cycle shocks than male hours. And this is the same evidence, but by occupation. Here, what we are presenting is the standard deviation of log hours, the cyclical component, as a ratio to the standard deviation of GDP. So this is the all occupations that you saw in the previous graph, again, for in the aggregate and for women and men. And this is by the 4 occupational categories that we constructed. So flex high, flex low, inflexible high, and inflexible low. And you can see that, within occupation, there's still a pretty large gender difference in the degree of cyclicality of hours. The only, sector, or the only occupational group in which there isn't much gender difference is the flexible low contact occupation, all those professional, managerials, and sales occupation, which are not very cyclical in general. But particularly for the inflexible occupations, you can see that there's a huge gender difference in the cyclicality of hours. And the same pattern emerges if we look at the contemporaneous correlation with GDP. So in standard recessions, the gender difference in the degree of cyclicality isn't completely accounted for by the occupational distribution or the industry distribution. This is in the draft. I won't talk about it today. So there is an intrinsic gender difference, which in prior work and sort of consistent with estimated structural model of intra-household insurance can be explained by particularly married women increasing their labor supply at the start of the recession as a function of this intra-household insurance mechanism. Now, what I want to focus on next is to examine the real-time impact of COVID-19. So, so here we are using basically data from the most recent employment situation reports from March and April, and I guess tomorrow we'll be able to add, the May data. So we'll need to do some updating as well tomorrow. But what you can see here is month-to-month log variation in hours per capita by gender and in total for workers in different occupations. So this is at the worker level. And again, the top two graphs are for flexible occupation, respectively high contact on the left and low contact on the right. And then the bottom two charts are for inflexible occupation, respectively low contact respectively high contact on the left and low contact on the right. And what you can see here is that in most of these occupational categories, there is a bigger drop in hours per capita for women, and the difference is quite substantial. You can see it. The timing of the major drop varies by month, by occupation. The only exception is inflexible high contact occupations, where we actually see a slightly bigger decline for men than for women. But in all the other occupations, when it comes to hours per capita, the decline is biggest for women. The next graph instead, sorry, I switched this around. This is the employment to population ratio, I'm sorry. And the next graph is hours per capita, which is the pattern is very similar to the employment to population ratio, because as we all know, at the cyclical frequency, most movements in hours are in fact driven by the extensive margin. So we see this here as well. The next graph that I'm going to show you is the unemployment rate. So here again, there's a much bigger rise in the unemployment rate for women than for men in all occupations except for inflexible high contact occupations, where it is actually slightly higher for women. Now, so this pattern suggests that in general, women have been hit most by the COVID shock in terms of decline in hours and employment, and except for in the inflexible high contact occupations, where though women or men are underrepresented. And so one of the possible hypotheses behind the fact that in inflexible high contact occupation, men seem to have lost more employment, more hours, and have seen a slightly bigger increase in the unemployment rate could be a selection mechanism, because inflexible high contact occupations are the most female dominated, with the female share being 74%. So it is possible that the selection of men in those occupations is slightly different than the selection of men in more male dominated or more gender balanced occupation, and this is driving part of the finding. But overall, the picture that comes from this, from the real-time data, is that women have been more impacted in terms of decline in hours. The next thing that we look at is earnings, and here the picture is mostly consistent with the hours and employment pattern. So what you can see here that in low contact occupations, women experience a bigger drop in earnings than for men, both in March and in April relative to the previous month. And then instead we see that in high contact occupation, earnings drop more for men. Particularly in April, where for inflexible and high contact occupation. And we haven't explored this yet, but as I mentioned earlier, there might be a pattern here that could be driven by selection of men into very heavily dominated occupations, such as the inflexible high contact. Now, what I'm going to show you next is some evidence at the household level. So in particular, we are going to look at earnings at the household level, which is just here are defined as earlier as the total labor income jointly of both spouses. And I should also mention that here, because I should have mentioned it earlier, we are looking at two-earner households, because obviously we have the occupation of the husband and the wife. So, and that is sort of necessary to perform this analysis. So we are, so that is, you know, a subset of all households, but it is the majority of all married households here. And so what you can see here, so the way the charts are organized is that the chart corresponds to an occupation of the wife, particularly the chart on the left. For the chart on the left, the wife is in a flexible high contact occupation. And then the different bars correspond to different occupations of the husband. So we have 4 different household types here. And essentially, what you can see here is that you know, there is quite a bit of heterogeneity at the household level in terms of the decline in earnings. In general, the households that experience the biggest drop in earnings have either one of the spouses in a high contact or inflexible occupation. And so you see this here in this graph. So for the flexible high contact wife, the biggest decline here in earnings in April is for inflexible high contact husband households. We can, you know, if we change the household types, we can see this very clearly here. And so obviously this is a lot of variation in earnings. I don't want to focus on focus necessarily on each different household types, but on the big picture that the COVID shock itself hits households in a very different ways. And so one of the implications of the shock is going to be a fanning out potentially of household level inequality, focusing on these 2 earner households, which is something that we are going to explore in the context of the model. And another thing that we can see from this household earnings chart is that there is quite a bit of variation also in the timing and in the persistence of these earnings drops. So for certain types of households, the earnings drops are very large already in March, but then are somewhat reversed or are not amplified further in April. Instead, for other types of households, you know, the earnings drops are much larger in April than in March. And this is a function of, you know, the timing of how the COVID shock has impacted employment and any social distancing and mitigation measures for that particular occupation. And it's going to be interesting going forward to see, you know, if we see a convergence, you know, back to pre-pandemic level in these earnings and employment values and how that varies across occupations. But with the real-time data, we can see that there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in terms of when we see the onset of the earnings effect of the COVID-19 shock at the household level. Okay, so then to summarize the empirical evidence quickly, what we have seen is that women are overrepresented in inflexible high contact occupations, which we were thinking would be the most sensitive to the COVID-19 shock. And in fact, we did see have lost most employment and hours in response to that shocks. And instead, men are overrepresented in inflexible occupation that typically exhibit a lot of high business cycle risk, but have also been impacted by the COVID-19 shock. And though 32% of households are in a category which we don't think will experience a large impact of the COVID shock because they're inflexible and low contact of occupations. And these types of households are the ones that are also least exposed to standard recession. And the real-time data confirms what we were conjecturing in terms of the impact of the COVID-19 shock, both at the occupation level and at the gender level, that sort of motivated the whole analysis. Now, what I will do in the rest of the talk is go through a simple macro model that we are going to use to sort of quantify the impact of these forces, both in terms of household or inter-household redistribution, but then ultimately also to think about the aggregate impact of the COVID shock, and to also think about potential policy responses and mitigation strategies that could occur via tax policies or transfer policies and so on. And so the model is going to basically be closely tied to the empirical analysis in that there's going to be differentiation by gender, occupation, and industry. And there's going to be this integrated CR dynamics, which is very simple. And so here we follow the literature on that. So let me just jump in and show you what the model is like. So I won't spend any time on the SIR population dynamics, except to say that our model is in discrete time. So we adapt the standard SIR model to a discrete time formulation. And the most important parameter from the standpoint of the economics of the model is actually the shed rate, which is going to be denoted with beta T following the SIR literature, even if it's bad notation in economics. And the other important variable from the standpoint of economic decisions coming from the SIR model for us is going to be the fraction of infected, or the infection rate, which is going to be referred to as IT, which is simply the fraction in the population that have contracted the virus. So beta T and IT are going to matter for individual decisions in the model. Other than that, the way we use the CIR model is to just map out different paths of the infection rate, which are going to be exogenous in our simulations. And I will talk about what they are when we get to the end. Instead, with respect to the economic model, so this is what it looks like. So for today, we're going to look at an economy that only contains married households. And so the next step will be to also introduce single households, which are going to look very similar, except they're going to be made of one person. So our married households, there's going to be L types of them, and the types are going to correspond to the occupation of the wife and the husband. So consistent with our empirical analysis, there's going to be 4 occupations based on the flexibility, flexible, inflexible, or a degree of contact, so high and low contact. And so there are 16 possible household types. So occupation and household types are exogenous and given and cannot be changed. So you need to think about this economy as it already got organized into a particular household structure, and we look at it after that has happened. So occupation distribution and household distribution are going to be exogenous and consistent with the data. So a household of type L is infinitely lived and derives utility from 2 types of consumption goods, the C good and the S good. So C is the standard consumption good. So think about commodities. We will match it later to data that has to do with more expenditures on goods. S stands for social. So, so the types of goods and services that require some kind of interaction for their consumption. So you can think about food at home as being part of C, and food at a restaurant as being part of S. And we're going to use the CEX basically to determine, which categories we should think of as C, the standard good, as opposed to which categories correspond to S, the social good. So U is a standard utility function. Utility is increasing in both goods. Here, the way the infection comes in is very similar to what has been modeled before, which is that there is the demand or the preference for the social goods depends on infection risk. So V is a function which is basically decreasing in the risk of becoming infected, which depends on IT, the fraction of people in the population who are infected, and beta T, which is the infection rate. So here the beta T is the health parameter. It's not the discount factor beta. Sorry for the bad notation, but we just wanted to follow the convention of just keeping the notation for the SIR model as it's done in that literature. So basically, if there's an increase in the infection rate, that is going to make the social good less desirable, and households will adjust their consumption as a result. Households, share consumption. So there's a joint utility from the consumption good, but they're separate this utility from labor supply. So H corresponds to total hours worked by each household member J, which is F or M, so female or male. And so the curvature is allowed to depend on gender to capture the fact that the friction elasticity of labor supply differs across gender. And here there's the additional terms in the disutility of labor here are phi of J. That's just a scaling factor for the disutility of labor. And that varies across gender to match the fact that on average, female hours per capita are lower than male hours per capita. And the phi of J's are going to be calibrated to match this gender difference pre-pandemic in hours worked. And then the other term that you see here is this eta of I. So this is a disutility term, which is going to capture the effect of becoming infected on labor supply. So this is something that we adopted in my paper with Claudio Olivetti, where we were looking at the days lost to disability, in that case associated to maternal morbidity. It's a procedure that the World Health Organization uses. So the idea is that if you become infected for a certain number of days, you will not be able to work. And so it's as if labor supply will become more costly from a disutility standpoint, and that will reduce your labor supply. So this is going to be calibrated basically to match the standard length of a COVID infection, as well as the fraction of people in the population that are contracting COVID based on the SIR dynamics. And so this is the disutility of labor supply. The initial wrinkle with respect to the disutility of labor supply is in the formulation of total hours. So if you, total hours, so the capital H of J are given by two components. Little l is the amount of work that you do in the workplace. Let's call them work hours. And you can see that is multiplied by a function VW that depends on the infection rate. So this is capturing the fact that if you have a risk of getting infected, then the disutility of performing hours at the workplace is going to be higher. And this is what captures that dimension. And then instead H is going to be hours that you work remotely or at home outside of the workplace. And so there, even if there is an infection, it doesn't bother you. And so that would correspond to H. So the households, are going to choose how much L and how much little H, to supply to work, and that's of course going to depend on the risk of infection. So again, the higher the infection rate, the more households will choose to perform work at home if they can or remotely, as opposed to in the workplace. And V of W is going to be essentially increasing in this infection risk. Now, so this is on the household side. So on the production side, we are going to have two sectors that produce each of the two goods, and then the four occupations and the two genders. And so this is how production looks like. So at the top level, production of the two goods, this is a standard neoclassical production function with a good specific TFP. Now, L tilde of I, where I stands for the two goods, is a labor input aggregator. And the first dimension of aggregation is occupations. So if you are, each sector I can take labor from the four occupations, LOI, and here the intensity of demand of labor from the different occupations will depend on the sector and is captured by these parameters zeta. And of course, a rho is going to govern the elasticity of substitution between occupations at the sectoral level. We assume that that elasticity of substitution doesn't vary across sectors. The gender level comes next. And so for each occupation, And the labor input is generated by aggregating with the CES aggregator female, male labor in that occupation. And again, here, gamma is going to determine the elasticity of substitution between female and male labor in each occupation. And the omegas can be thought of determining occupation-specific comparative advantage by gender. And so the zetas and the omegas are going to be calibrated to match the distribution of occupation across industries, the C and the S industry, and also the distribution of workers by gender across occupations. And we're going to be able to match the empirical distribution with these parameters. But the elasticity of substitution is going to be a constant, across industries and across occupations with respect to these two aggregators. And then this is where the working remotely or working at home comes in. So L is the hours that the employers are going to get from each workers. And they are a sum of two components: the hours that the employees work in the workplace, little l, and then the hours that the employees work remotely, little h. And phi of O, which varies by occupation, is the relative productivity of hours worked at home versus hours worked in the workplace. And we're going to make the stark assumption that for inflexible occupations, that phi of O is 0. So either you work in the workplace or you cannot produce any labor input for your employer. And then for flexible occupations, we're going to calibrate that to be below 1, but quite close to 1, sort of reflecting the anecdotal evidence of how much people are working and what they're getting done in flexible occupations. So this is the production side. Firms are perfectly competitive. There is free entry, and also wages are equated by industry, or by occupation across industry. So occupation is fixed, but if you are in a given occupation gender category, you will be paid the same irrespective of the sector in which you work. So workers do not really care about sector at all. And so that's something that is a feature of the equilibrium of the model. So the household budget constraint is standard. So wages depend on gender and occupation. So here, if we look at the household budget constraint, they're going to be denoted with an L. Households own the capital, they make capital accumulation decisions, and there's a relative price of the consumption, the standard, and the social good, which is PT. There is a government that potentially taxes, potentially transfers, and there's an exogenous government consumption. So not much to say here. Now, in the time we have left, let me talk a little bit about how we calibrate this model and show you some initial results on simulating a pandemic dynamic path in the context of this model. Before I even get to the calibration, though, let me just make a couple of premises. So because in this version of the model, we are only looking at an economy in which every household is a married household, sort of by construction, we are missing, all single households. And so the next step in the model would be to introduce those households. So any results are sort of conditional on that premise. The other thing here is that, in the context of this model, there is no extensive margin. Sort of by design, we wanted it to be close to a standard RBC model to the extent that it was possible. And so any intra-household insurance coming from labor supply of one spouse or the other is going to come from the intensive margin only. And so that's something that is going to be reflected in the model. Now, switching to the calibration. So we use the CEX basically to identify goods that can be put either in the standard or in the social category. And all the details are in the draft, but just to give you a broad idea, goods that are usually referred to as commodities or do not require any kind of interaction for consumptions are, we put them in the standard. So food at home, housing, utility, apparel, furnishings, drugs, visual equipment, and so on. And instead, goods that require some kind of social interaction are put into the social category. So a lot of service type consumption falls into the social category. Now, we use a standard CS aggregator between to model the utility across the two goods. Essentially, we find that the standard consumption good, if we look at CEX data on the share of expenditures in what we refer to as standard versus social goods, the standard consumption good is quite small. So mu is going to correspond to the fraction of expenditures that are in the standard consumption good. It's less than 20%. So most of expenditure here is actually in what we refer to as the social good in the calibrated model. Now, the elasticity of substitution between these two goods is not obvious. So there is a literature thinking about the role of the service sector and female labor supply that interprets, the social good as services. In that literature, the elasticity of substitution between goods and services is usually set to 0 or very close to 0. We thought that was a little bit, extreme as an assumption. So we fixed this elasticity of substitution to be 25%. And we will do some robustness analysis, on that later. Now, the Frisch elasticity here is set in the aggregate to be 75. And then we set the female over male to be equal to 3, which is consistent with empirical evidence in the last 30 years or so. And then we use estimates for the elasticity of substitution between occupations based on estimates from microdata that we derived in a paper that I have with Monica Mertz and Jacopo Morchio. And here there isn't much evidence on this that is independent. So this is another aspect we will do quite a bit of robustness analysis. Other than that, other parameters are either standard and we take them from independent evidence, or they're matched to 2019. I won't bore you with all the parameters here. I did want to spend a minute on the parameters in the labor input aggregators, which are derived from labor income shares at the industry and occupation level, because these determine the intensity of demand of labor by occupation in the different industries, as well as the intensity of demand of labor by gender in the different occupations. And you can see that here, there's quite a bit of concentration. So in the standard good, the two biggest categories are flexible and inflexible low contact occupation. And there's virtually no demand coming for high contact occupation. On the other hand, in the social good, you can see that flex low contact and inflex high and inflex low contact are the biggest categories. So any change in demand for the social good is going to, determine a bigger change in demand of labor in these particular occupations. And then if we look at the share of labor income by gender, again, you can see that the gender representation in these different occupations reflects the omegas at the occupational level. And so this is how we pin them down. Now, to get to the simulation that we have presented for you, we take some standard CIR parameters from Atkinson. So I won't discuss those. There's a number of health-related parameters here. So one is the parameters that determines the degree to which demand for the social good and supply of work to the workplace depend on the infection risk. And here we just take numbers that were sort of calibrated in the paper by Kaplan, Moll, and Violante that was presented here a while ago. And we're actually recalibrating that based on the real-time data that we have now. And in terms of the impact of the infection risk on labor supply, we use basically CDC evidence on, for people who are infected if the typical length of the disease is 4.3 days, and then we use that and the infection rate to determine the degree to which being infected reduces labor supply. Those are, the relevant parameters that I wanted to discuss. So let me just show you an initial simulation that we have done, or one of the simulations that we have done that we think is reasonably realistic in terms of the evolution of the pandemic. So we start with a reproduction rate for the virus of 3, and we end at a reproduction rate of 1.6. And then this parameter eta determines the degree to which the reproduction rate slows down and converges to its final number. And again, this is one of the possible formulations in the Atkinson paper that we thought was pretty conservative. And we have many more in the paper. And what I want to focus on with respect to this particular simulation is the impact, the differential impact on hours by gender, and also the impact on household level inequality. So let's start, though, first with some aggregate responses. So what you see here in these two graphs, so is the response in consumption of the social good, which is the one that is affected by the infection rate, and the horizontal axis measures months since the first case, which is months since the start of the pandemic, and you can see that here. There is a substantive about 15% decline in consumption of the service good, in the consumption of the social good, which troughs about a year after the start of the pandemic. And this is because here we do not have any mitigation measures. So the spread of the pandemic is just completely determined by the SIR model. We don't have any government intervention, in month 1 or 2, causing, production of the service of the social good to be shut down. And so that's something that we can incorporate later. So the timing of the response of the economy is just completely driven by the timing of the SIR model. And then you can see that in response to that, there's a decline in the price of the social good in equilibrium. And overall, because our elasticity of substitution between the standard and the social good is relatively low compared to, say, what Ulig, Kruger, and all used in their paper, we do have a pretty big drop in total expenditures in our model. And the size of the total expenditure drop in the aggregate and the output effect really depends critically on this elasticity of substitution. But now let's get to the results that we're most interested in here. So this is just simply the log variation in total female hours and total male hours by occupation. So the cut here is just by occupation over the course of the pandemic. And you can clearly see here that the scales are different across the two graphs. So the magnitude of the drop is much smaller for female workers than it is, it's much larger, I'm sorry, for female workers than it is for male workers. And you can also see that the inflexible high contact and the inflexible low contact occupation so the inflexible occupations in practice, exhibit the largest initial drop in hours. So there's second upward spike here that looks like hours are overshooting relative to the post-pandemic steady state. It's just a reflection of the fact that hours fall a lot during the pandemic for certain occupations. And so there's then a big rise in response to that. So the model captures, this gender difference in the impact in terms of hours and equilibrium labor supply by occupation that we saw in the data. And this is because the model matches quite well the distribution by gender across occupation and the distribution of occupation across industries. And so this is what is reflected here. Now, this is some evidence at the household level, again, for months since the start of the pandemic. This is the log variation in household level earnings, income, for different types of households. So all would be the entire household sector, the solid red line. And then I just focused on the household types that are most, that are largest in the populations. So the dotted blue line is this flex low contact workers, all the professional occupations. And you can see that they experience a decline in income, but it's relatively smaller when compared to occupations in which, for example, both the husband and the wife are in inflexible high contact occupation. And so this gives you a sense of the differential impact at the household level of the variation in earnings. And so we can turn to what's going to be the last slides of result for today, which is the impact on household level inequality. So to look at that here, basically what we are showing is ratios of earnings in the course of the pandemic across different household types. So the dotted blue line is the ratio of earnings for households in which both spouses are in flex low contact occupation to households in which both spouses are in flex low contact occupation. And remember, those are the two types of households that have respectively the highest household earnings and the lowest household earnings pre-pandemic. And you can see that there's a big impact in the gap in earnings across these two households types. The red line is the ratio of earnings for all households that in which both spouses are in flexible low contact occupation relative to aggregate household income. And again, this is just to show that this particular type of household, which though is a large category, 32% of all households are in this category, tends to increase their relative standing compared to other types of households. And then if you look at the bottom, these are the households where their income is already relatively low, and moreover, it drops compared to other household types as a consequence of the pandemic. And the lowest household income and the ones that experience the biggest drop relative to average household income is for household types in which the husband is in flex low occupation and the wife is in flex high occupation. And these comprise 19% of all households. And the dotted red line are households in which the wife is in inflexible high contact occupation, irrespective of where the husband works. And this is relative to the average for all households. And these types of households also, their income drops relative to the rest of the population. And this bottom green line looks at all households in which the husband is in an inflex low contact occupation. And you can see that these households have low earnings, but are not affected very much with respect to average household income, partly because husbands are in low contact occupations, so their employment doesn't and their earnings do not move much in response to the pandemic. So this is what we have for today. So let me quickly wrap up. This is obviously incomplete analysis because, as I mentioned, we don't have single households in the model yet. But we wanted to, have a model that can be easily matched to the data and sort of to think about the impact of occupational distribution by gender and also assortative matching, by household across occupation in terms of thinking about the effect of COVID-19. And basically building on this analysis, the main goal is to try and think about, should stimulus and relief programs, take these household level mechanisms into account, because most policy measures do not really think about this dimension. Ultimately, this is a model in which all the effects die with the pandemic. In practice, we think that, and there have been media reports on this, there might be some long run effects of this change by gender and by occupation of demand for hours and employment. In particular, if you're in an occupation that has exhibited a lot of employment decline as a function of COVID, do you experience human capital depreciation? Do some sectors, permanently change in size, and what effect does that have more in the long run on earnings by gender and at the household level? So ultimately, we plan to explore these questions as well. But for now, we're sort of thinking more of the direct impact. And so the next step is to think about policy responses that might be helpful along this dimension. I'm done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stefania. That was really interesting. There were a lot of really good questions in the Q&A. So before I call on the first person who already has their hand up, just want to remind you all, if you have questions that you would like to raise so we can get the conversation going, just use the raise your hand option at the bottom of your screen. So let me open. All right, so we have a question from Veronica Rappaport. Veronica, I'm going to allow you to talk and then you can unmute yourself.
Oh, hi, Stefania. This was really interesting.
Hi.
I have two questions. You already mentioned one of it, which is then partially answered, which is the inclusion of singles. Because in the model, you have something about assortative matching, the frequencies of having the different type of employment in household, but there's also this idea of insurance, and I wonder, which introduces complementarities, and I wonder if by comparing with the dynamics of singles, you can tell them apart. How much is the sum of the two times the frequency of having assortative matching relative to the complementarities of the two? And the second question concerns children. In here, you're not differentiating households with and without children. And I wonder whether this COVID-19 recession is different in that schools are closed, and that might affect also the elasticity of women differently than in other recessions.
Yes, both are good questions. Rania, do you want to go ahead?
So I can start by answering the second one, which I tried to answer in the Q&A. So regarding the children, no children. So I think you're right in the sense that we would think that women might choose to quit and things like that. I think that's what you're referring to. But I think the crisis basically had no distinction in who's losing their job. So everyone was impacted, whether you have children, whether you don't have children. So we're gonna look into in the data as to whether we see something different, but I doubt we'll see in the early onset of this pandemic some difference, across those who have children versus not, because it was pretty, it's a shock, it's exogenous, it affected everyone equally. Later on, things might be different, meaning in the fall when we're gonna start seeing the economy maybe starting to recover. There, I believe we might be seeing different responses across different households, not only whether they have children or not, but I think the age of children will be also important. I don't know how much we can incorporate that into the model, but at least documenting that in the data would be interesting.
Yeah,
so I hope I answered that question.
I would agree with that. One very, if you want, mechanical way that we could model that is that thinking about, well, for households with children, the relative productivity of working at home is lower than for households without children. And so that, that parameter could be capturing that. And you can also think about that it may, and again, this is very mechanical, you can think that it varies by gender as a function of the distribution of homework as well. So that would be a very mechanical way to capture it. But it's safe to say that, for at least this version, we are really not capturing that. With respect to the assortative matching and the singles versus not, introducing singles also is important for two reasons. Well, first of all, there's about 35–40% of them in the data, depending on how you count them. And also, particularly for the distributional impact, single households, both male-headed and female-headed households, have per capita lower earnings. So they're more vulnerable to the effects of any recession just because they have on average lower earnings, they have lower levels of accumulated savings, and they don't have, another spouse that could potentially work more or less and sort of provide this mechanism of intra-household insurance. So, and there's also going to be gender difference in the degree to which earnings for single households vary from earnings for married households by gender. So we know that a lot of female-headed households in the US tend to have lower earnings and lower accumulated wealth than male-headed households in the US. There's that. On the assortative matching, so essentially the assortative matching that you see by occupation in the data really reflects the assortative matching by education that we know quite a bit about and that Rania has done a lot of work on. So we see this big cluster of this flexible, low contact occupation completely dominated by college educated spouses where both spouses have college. And then there's quite a bit of heterogeneity among households in which both spouses don't have college completed, whereas in most of those households, the husband is in an inflexible low contact or at least inflexible occupation. There's more variation in the occupation of the wife, and to some degree also a little bit of variation in the educational attainment of the wife. But I think the sorting by occupation mainly mirrors the sorting by education. And I don't know if Rania wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's mainly going to reflect the sorting by education. I think I looked at that in the data as well, and it's, I would say, roughly at least a 90% correlation between education and those, dimensions, which is reflected in the table where we see the actual occupations in that matrix of the 2 by 2. We see the types of occupations that are highly correlated with education.
And also in the earnings, we see that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. So I want to encourage you to ask there's actually 2 questions in the Q&A that I don't think were answered via the Q&A. Oh, okay. So we have someone who just raised their hand, and then maybe, I don't know if you want to answer live the questions in the Q&A after that.
Okay.
So Jonathan Heathcote has a question. So Jonathan, just unmute yourself.
Hi, Stefania. It's a very nice paper. And I had one question. I guess you decided to model the labor supply side mostly as a sort of a labor supply choice. Mm-hmm. And you said you abstracted from the extensive margin, but it seems like, unemployment is a big part of this recession, and seems like that's probably going to have, unemployment's going to have a big impact on inequality across households, and I wondered if you thought more about that. It does seem like that's sort of a pretty first order aspect of this crisis.
No, I agree that it's so this COVID recession is no different from any other recession in the sense that most of the decline in hours comes from the extensive margin, not on the intensive margin, and so in that sense it's absolutely first order. And the reason we did not initially model it here is, first of all, technically it's a little bit simpler, so we don't have a lot of non-convexity going on. And then we can, even just with an intensive margin, we can match the fluctuations in earnings and overall hours per capita very well, even with this model. But one aspect that is missing, if you want, from this analysis is the distinction between 2-earner households and 1-earner households for married households. And though 2-earner households are the majority of married households and cohabitating couples in the U.S. population these days, there is still, a fraction of households that are 1-earner. And so, not having the extensive margin doesn't enable us to capture, the differential impact on 2-earner versus 1-earner households, which is potentially important, particularly with respect to the ability of, somebody who's not in the labor force, to, look for work, for example, because the primary earner, loses their job. Now, that at some level is more important for thinking about a standard recession than it is for the current recession, because what we know from standard recessions where we see female participation rise at the start of a recession. So you can enter the labor force if you are out of the labor force. So a lot of this mechanism, is coming from women who were either temporarily or had been for a long time up to the labor force and re-enter in order to offset, missing earnings from their spouse or primary earner. But when they enter, they usually enter the service industry or service occupations, because the demand for service employment usually doesn't fall very much in a standard recession. In this COVID recession, if you're trying to enter the labor force in the service sector, or what we call the social sector, you would have a really hard time. So at some level, there's going to be this additional dimension that for one earner households, there's the secondary earner, if they are the wife and they're trying to enter in occupations that have a social component, the jobs are not going to be there. So at some level, I agree, it's for thinking about two earner households, it's not as important, but it is going to be important for looking at these marginal households where they are one earner, and for comparing this recession to the standard recession. So I would agree with that, and we certainly would consider introducing that in an iteration.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have another hand up. Ning Zhang, I'm going to allow you to speak. Just unmute yourself.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Stefania. It's a really interesting work. So I have a question about the gender earnings gap. So now the model, like for a couple, we don't consider the gender earnings gap. But if we don't consider that, don't we miss important mechanism that the within household labor supply allocation depends on the relative earnings of the two couple? And also, like the household insurance value will different if a high earner working more or a low earner working more.
Rania, do you want to take it? Rania? Right. Is she there?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, I'm here, sorry. So we don't have exogenous, gender earning gap, but there is a productivity difference in the model, which is essentially a reflection of a different income process for male versus female. So in some sense, it is taken into account. Now, you're right, we don't have the endogenous decisions that you are talking about. Also, Jonathan mentioned the extensive margin. You're talking about extensive, actually also unintensive. Adding those would highly complicate the model. So I think for this iteration of the paper, we're probably going to abstract from those for now, because again, this pandemic has come, equally on everyone. It's an exogenous shock that hits everyone. I don't think there was a lot of decision making taken that could take place basically within the household as to whether to participate and as how much. At least as of now, it's not. Maybe later as we recover, but right now it's. I don't think it's a primary factor that should affect the results of the model. Stefania, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree with that. So we are not matching or trying to match the gender wage gap in the data. But actually, I didn't have time to show all the steady state properties of the model. We do a reasonably good job at matching the gender wage gap within occupation. And that's because we are basically matching the labor income share by gender in each occupation to the data. And that is a function of, the relative hours as well as the relative wages. So the model, even if we're not trying to match the gender wage gap, does a reasonably good job of matching the gender wage gap by occupation. But if we wanted to match it precisely, we would need to introduce sort of like an extra, sort of like an exogenous tax on women, or a a relative productivity shock that hits all women irrespective of the occupation where they work, and then we would be able to get close. What that would do, it would be another mechanism to, in the pre-pandemic steady state, that allows you to match the difference in average hours worked by gender. But then my conjecture is that it wouldn't really affect the model's response to the SIR dynamics. So I don't think that's a big factor. Yeah.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so C1 Hoor, allow you to talk, just unmute yourself.
Okay. Hey, Stefania, Georgia Talk. So can you just clarify and maybe show us the value function again? I was wondering why maybe you just chose to show us one, but so if, for example, if I'm a recovered household or an infected household, I shouldn't care about the risk of being infected.
Yeah.
So I didn't see why that was not like a relevant state.
So this is an infinitely lived model, right? So, the way we think about it is that we think there's going to be some limited, immunity for some period of time, after you have contracted COVID, but we don't know exactly how long that's going to last and, how, effective it is, if it's a complete immunity, partial immunity, and so on. So, but because it's an infinitely lived model, so we're not modeling, you get the disease or not as a shock, but we're just modeling sort of the average incidence of potentially being infected in the population. And I'm glad you asked this, because this is actually a refinement that we want to work on. So basically, so your certainty equivalent effect of contracting the disease is captured by this eta of the infection rate, which reduces your labor supply. And there's a bunch of really strong assumptions in that. First of all, that you can model it as a certainty equivalent, and it only varies over time with the infection risk. And so that's what determines its evolution over time in the population. And then, so the other thing is that it's the same across everybody. One obvious thing to do, even keeping this very strong sort of certainty equivalent formulation, would be to make it vary by occupation. So if you're in an occupation that has, high contact, you are more likely to get it than in another occupation. So here, essentially, from the standpoint of an infinite horizon model, given what the mortality and morbidity risk is and what the morbidity looks like for most people who are prime age and contracted, essentially this eta component is very small. So what really drives things in the model is the sensitivity of demand for the social good and the sensitivity of supply of workplace hours. Those are really, really important. This eta is on average really, really tiny. But if we were to make it, higher for certain types of occupation, then the labor supply effect of just getting the disease, would play a larger role for selected occupations. So we haven't done yet. So basically think about it as sort of as an average effect in the population, and it's not modeled as you get the shock. So you get the disease, you don't get the disease. So that's the way it's done here. And this is consistent with some morbidity modeling that I've done before. It's very analytically convenient. Obviously, it's not very realistic, but given the incidence itself of the disease on prime age workers that are not retired, it's not going to matter all that much.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we have a few minutes left. Since there's no more hands raised, I think maybe I just had a comment to make on the data and the mapping from the data into the model. So I know you split these occupations into like above and below median on these two measures, which is also what we did in our work. And I think that's less of an issue when you're just trying to think about like, is one set of occupations relatively more sensitive than the other? Whatever, then you could put the cutoff wherever you like, kind of. But these indices don't really have a cardinality. Mm-hmm. So, well, you could. So basically, when you take those over to the model, you just split it above and below median into like high flexibility, low flexibility, for example. And then you go, and then you actually put a level on that, in the sense that the low flexibility jobs are the ones that are going to have like zero ability to work from home. Whereas in reality, in the data, you could have like all the jobs being bunched between like 0.8 and 1 on the index. So they all can be done at home, but now you kind of split them kind of randomly. And the same goes for the other index. So I think maybe just for the part of taking it to the model, it might make more sense to try to use more of the ordinal aspect, more of the cardinal aspects of it, like the proximity data actually has a cardinality on it. Like it tells you how close you are to people. And then it might make more sense to choose a cutoff based on that. And same thing for work from home. You could use the translation to the ATUS and maybe actually map it into hours. There were a significant amount of occupations that actually got a 0 on that.
Yeah.
So it was just a comment.
Yeah, so on the proximity side, actually, so there I slightly misspoke, because we do actually use the cardinality in the end, because you use this, the 6 feet essentially, part of the question. So there is one of the questions in ONET that asks you exactly the distance that you need to be. And so I think this final classification is based on, I think there are 6 categories based on the physical distance, which is measured in actual distance from the coworkers, and we use the 6 feet category. So if you have to be less than 6 feet, then it's a high contact. But Jiyeon can correct me if I'm wrong. But I agree with you. It's one of the problems. We looked at different types of robust ways of splitting the 2 categories, and there is definitely bunching where if you use the cardinality, you could probably get a little bit of a refinement. But maybe Jiyeon, if you want to step in and correct anything on that. Are you there, Jiyeon?
Yes, no, you're right. So about proximity, there is some cardinality component in ONET questions, but regarding flexibility, in ONET questions, there is no cardinality on that. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to look into the ATUS data as well. So yeah, we can add some cardinality to our distinction.
Yeah, and with the ATUS data, what we verified that overall, based on the question in ATUS, where you are actually asked if you can work from home and do you work from home, we got very similar fraction of people who are able to work from home. But I have to be frank, I do not remember like the underlying, classification. So that's something that we can do more robustness on.
And then just the last comment I had was about the essential workers, that you might want to bring in this coding of the essential workers just because you had this issue with the inflexible high.
Yeah. No,
and
so
that might be like the nurses.
Right. So that's something that we were really worried about at the beginning. And then we realized that, first of all, what was officially categorized as an essential worker in the US varies a lot across states, but also some workers that we thought would be essential, we saw huge drops in employment. So, the health sector is seen as an essential sector, but since in many, particularly the highly impacted areas, all elective procedures were halted. In fact, labor hours and earnings went down a lot for health professionals, and there's only a small fraction of health professionals that were deemed essential. And this was not true, for example, in Europe. It's just a function of how the labor market for health professionals has worked in the United States and how the essential designation was found. But overall, the fraction of workers who are effectively essential is very small. So it's not going to matter very much. So a lot of there's a lot of essential workers in these low contact, inflexible occupations, protective service occupations, and so on. But we saw quite a bit of decline in hours in those occupations as well, because though an occupation might be essential, they only maybe need 1 worker if a plant is closed or if an office building is closed. So it's a little bit, we thought it would be very important, and we sort of realized that in practice, the magnitude of the essential sector was a little bit varying across states, and also in practice, that sector had also been impacted. I think this is not true for delivery workers and grocery store workers. So, but many categories of essential workers, in the end, they were also hit by declining hours. But I agree, it's something that we can probably do a better job of addressing in the data.
Okay, so I think at this point we're ready to wrap up basically. So thank you so much for coming on VMACS. Yeah, so just a reminder, we have a presentation next week on Tuesday. Christina Ariano, Jan Bai, and Gabriel Mihalachi, Deadly Debt Crises, COVID-19 in Emerging Markets. And with that, we'll close. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
Thank you.